The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood where Koby had spent his entire childhood. Koby had always been an introverted and troubled young man, struggling with a sense of anger and frustration that he couldn't quite explain. His parents had tried their best to support him, but they were often at a loss for how to help their troubled son. One evening, when Koby was just 16 years old, his simmering anger reached a breaking point. He had been bullied at school for years, and he couldn't take it any longer. That evening, as darkness descended, he sneaked out of his house with a plan in mind. He knew the house of one of his tormentors, a boy named Jake who had made his life miserable for as long as he could remember. Koby approached Jake's house with a sense of purpose, his heart pounding in his chest. He had a small can of spray paint in his pocket. Quietly, he approached the front of Jake's house and began to graffiti the side of it with hateful messages and symbols. His hands shook with a mixture of fear and adrenaline as he vandalized the property. As Koby finished defacing Jake's house, he felt a strange rush, a twisted satisfaction in taking revenge against someone who had tormented him. It was his first taste of the power he could wield over others through unlawful actions. He slipped away into the night, leaving behind a trail of vandalism that would soon be discovered. The next day, the police were called and an investigation began. Koby watched from a distance as the neighborhood buzzed with activity. He felt a strange mix of guilt and excitement as the authorities closed in on the perpetrator, unaware that he was the one responsible. Koby's graffiti incident marked the beginning of a dark path that would eventually lead to much more serious crimes, including the murder he would later commit. It was a moment that he would never forget, a moment when he first tasted the rush of breaking the law and exerting control over others, setting him on a destructive course that would change his life forever. Koby's 18th birthday had come and gone, and he had become even more withdrawn and disturbed in the years since his first act of vandalism. His anger and violent tendencies had grown, and he had become increasingly obsessed with the idea of taking a life. He spent hours researching methods and planning his dark act. One fateful night, Koby's anger and compulsion reached a terrifying crescendo. He had been brooding over a perceived injustice for weeks, nursing a grudge that had consumed him entirely. On that ominous night, he put his sinister plan into motion. Koby stalked his victim, a man who had crossed his path in some way. Though the reasons had become distorted and twisted in his mind, as the unsuspecting man walked alone through a dimly lit alley, Koby attacked him with a cold and calculated brutality. The victim's cries for help were drowned out by the darkness, and Koby's heart raced with a sickening thrill as he committed his first murder. He left the lifeless body behind, feeling a rush of power and exhilaration that he had never experienced before. Following days were a blur of paranoia and fear for Koby. He knew he had committed a heinous act, and the weight of his actions began to eat away at him. He tried to bury the evidence, covering his tracks as best he could, but the guilt gnawed at his conscience. As news of the murder spread through the town, fear and panic gripped the community. The police launched a manhunt, and Koby lived in constant fear of being discovered. His dark secret would haunt him for the rest of his life, setting the stage for the even more chilling murder that would come later, the one that would ultimately lead to his arrest and conviction. Koby's descent into darkness and violence had taken a terrifying turn, leaving a trail of destruction and pain in his wake. Of course, let's continue with the flashback, exploring Koby's subsequent murders. Koby had crossed a line, and he couldn't turn back. The rush he had experienced from his first murder was intoxicating, and he craved it more than anything else. He began to meticulously plan his next killings, becoming even more methodical and calculated in his approach. Over the following months, Koby continued his reign of terror in the small town. Each victim was chosen with twisted reasoning, real or imagined grievances, or simply because they were convenient targets. He relished the power he felt as he ended lives, leaving a trail of death and fear in his wake. His second victim was a former classmate who had once humiliated him in front of his peers. Koby lured the unsuspecting young man to a remote location where he strangled him to death, savoring the feeling of control and domination. The third victim was a neighbor who had complained about Koby's strange behavior to the authorities. Koby broke into the man's home and brutally murdered him, leaving the scene as if nothing had happened. With each murder, Koby became more skilled at covering his tracks, leaving behind fewer clues for the police to follow. He reveled in the notoriety of being an elusive and unidentified serial killer, even as the town lived in a state of constant terror. The murders continued, each one more gruesome and horrifying than the last. Koby's appetite for violence seemed insatiable, and he grew increasingly bold. The police were baffled, unable to connect the dots between the seemingly unrelated deaths. But Koby's reign of terror would not go on indefinitely. As he became more careless and overconfident, he left behind a crucial piece of evidence that would ultimately lead to his arrest. The flashback to Koby's descent into darkness was nearing its end, setting the stage for the moment when the law would finally catch up with him. Koby's confession sent shockwaves through the small town where he lived. The news of the gruesome murder and his chilling admission spread quickly, leaving the community in a state of fear and disbelief. The local police launched a thorough investigation to gather evidence and build a case against Koby. As the investigation unfolded, it was revealed that Koby had a history of troubling behavior. His neighbors reported that he had become increasingly reclusive in recent months, rarely leaving his home. Some even mentioned that they had noticed strange odors emanating from his property. Forensic experts were called in to examine the wall where the victim's body had been concealed. It was a painstaking process that required precision and patience. As the bricks were carefully removed, the victim's identity was confirmed, and the cause of death was determined to be a severe blunt force trauma to the head. Koby's trial was highly publicized, and he was represented by a defense attorney who argued that he should be found not guilty by reason of insanity due to his admission of getting a killer rush. The prosecution, on the other hand, presented a compelling case, highlighting Koby's premeditated actions and lack of remorse. During the trial, Koby's mental state became a central point of contention. Psychiatric evaluations were conducted to assess his sanity at the time of the murder. The jury faced the difficult task of determining whether Koby was legally responsible for his actions, or if he should be declared mentally unfit to stand trial. After a lengthy trial, the jury reached a verdict. Koby was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Koby's conviction provided some closure to the victim's family, but the scars left by the horrifying crime would never fully heal. The case of Koby's murder and his admission of a killer rush continued to haunt the town for years, serving as a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk within even the most seemingly ordinary individuals.